Welcome to part 1 of African civilizations. Today in this episode, we will be talking about African geography and the part it played in African early civilizations, the Bantu migration, and Meroe, the Nile Valley civilization. Before we dive into our other topics, it's important to note that Africa is a geographic place, not an identity. The people living in Africa do not share a common cultural identity, language, religion, or really any common factors other than the fact that they all live on the same continent. Usually when we talk about Africa, sometimes we make some sweeping generalizations that the African people all did this or they all did that, and that's really not necessarily true. Africa, during the classical and post-classical period, had many outside influences. For example, North Africa was incorporated into the Roman Empire, causing the spread of Roman culture and Christianity in places like Egypt and Ethiopia. Or, on the opposite side, the Arabs will introduce things like the camel to the Sahara region. Crazy, I know, right, that the camel is not actually native to Africa. And the camel really helps trade and later spreads Islam into West Africa. One reason for the lack of unity in Africa is the geographic barriers that keep people from traveling long distances. They have all sorts of different terrains. They have rainforests along the Atlantic. They have the Sahara Desert in North Africa. They have the grasslands in Central Africa. So all of these things, they demonstrate the variety of resources and living conditions throughout Africa, and just big barriers that keep people from being able to move across Africa freely. 3 major movements that bring large-scale change in Africa, worth noting. Number 1, the Bantu migration from Central Africa down to South and East Africa, which we'll talk about later today. Number 2, the Polynesians bringing early Indian Ocean trade, which we'll talk about in a later episode. And number 3, Arabic merchants spread Islam along the east, which we will talk about again in a later episode. This should not be the first time that you hear the name Bantu in this course. The Bantu people have been around for between 3,000 to 4,000 years. Historians aren't exactly sure when they originated, but their language group is estimated to have been established around 3,000 years ago in what is now present-day Cameroon. The Bantu migration starts during the first millennium, and it's estimated that between 440 to 680 distinct language groups have Bantu influence. Side note, it's really hard for cultural unity if you can't speak the same language. It's like one of the problems that the African people are going to run into time and time again. So the Bantu people, they're really well known for spreading their iron tools and their technology throughout sub-Saharan Africa. They will introduce things like cattle, iron tools, weapons, slash and burn agriculture, and many more things to the people they migrate to. By the 8th century, the Bantu-speaking people will reach the coast of East Africa, and then a little bit later on will make it all the way down to the southernmost tip of South Africa. The Bantu religion is based off of ancestor worship and nature spirits, similarly to the Mayans and Chinese cultures in the way that they believe ancestors could be reached in the afterlife and then could help those here on Earth. So if you have a problem, you should call upon your dead ancestor to help you fix it. They did this through rituals and through animal sacrifice, especially cattle. They viewed cattle as something highly valuable and worth sacrificing. The Bantu also pass around the concept of continuous revelation, which basically means that gods continue to reveal divine principles or commandments to humanity. So there is no one right thing. The gods may tell you something else, and you just have to be available to accept that. The religion of the Bantu, like others in Africa during this time, were geographically confined. They were also not conversion religions, so people weren't spreading specific customs and beliefs around Africa. It really was just based off of where you were from. That's what you practiced, and you didn't expect neighboring people to practice the same way that you did. It's a much more accepting culture around religion. Now on to the people of Meroe. Meroe is a Nubian civilization south of Egypt that has been around almost as long as Egypt itself. Nubian culture really hits its stride around the time that Egypt starts falling, and the center of that power is located in the city and surrounding area of Meroe. Meroe was a patriarchal society based on kingship. Fun fact, rulers here were usually buried with sacrificial victims that they believed would be needed in the afterlife, very similar to the Egyptian customs after a pharaoh would die. It should sound a little familiar to you. The monarchs were also considered sacred, so it's really hard to argue with the monarch who says, "I need victims for the afterlife. I'm a sacred god." Anyways, the people of Meroe are really known throughout the area for their iron tools and weapon manufacturing. There was a very successful industry from them, and they had large-scale trade in this area, and we'll talk about that later. People that lived in rural areas mostly practiced farming and herding, and were asked to pay tribute to the monarch. High amounts of rainfall in this region made large agricultural production possible, which lessened the need for irrigation. Because people didn't need to be close to the Nile for irrigation purposes, they were able to spread out their farms and land. Because a large amount of Meroe's population wasn't in the center of the civilization, most people did not live under direct government control. So Meroe was actually a pretty chill place to live for the most part, as long as you're not one of those sacrificial victims that dies with the king. Meroe had most of its trade partners to the north along the Nile River, and the decline of Egypt put a big hit on their trade exports. Their main exports were things like cotton cloth, iron weapons, gold and ivory, tortoise shells, and ostrich feathers. Most of these things you'll notice are luxury goods. You don't need ostrich feathers and tortoise shells to survive. They just make really cool decorations. The decline of Meroe starts around 150 CE. The people of Meroe had negatively impacted their environment. They overused the soil, which made it no longer productive. They also continued most of the region's forests. When hard times hit Meroe, the demand for luxury goods, which if you remember, was most of their major exports, fell, and their economy tanked. Meroe was also experiencing conflicts with their neighbors, Axum, the next civilization we will talk about. When Axum officially conquered Meroe in the 4th century CE, there really wasn't much left of it to conquer. The city and the surrounding areas were mostly abandoned because it couldn't support crops anymore. One lasting effect from this region will be Coptic Christianity, basically a branch of Christianity that came through Egypt during the Roman occupation. Christianity from this region will spread to other places that we'll talk about later. Christianity in this region will thrive until Islamic merchants start spreading Islam in the 1300s. Thanks for listening to the first episode of African Civilizations. Next time, we'll talk about the Swahili coast and the spread of Islam across Africa. Thanks for watching.